the next few weeks where they're selling panels. I quite enjoy it and digest the
Trying the microphone first. Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent. I'm going to slightly look at it because I've turned it round so I don't have to go behind the lectern. But anyway, my name is Philippa Lloyd. I'm Vice Principal here at Queen Mary, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here tonight for this lecture on Clement Attlee, and to welcome the Attlee Foundation here too, as well as Professor John Davis. I'll just say that I know the weather's appalling outside. It always seems to be whenever we host the Attlee Foundation, they bring the rain. I don't know why, but they do. But also, just say that Queen Mary is incredibly proud of its roots in East London. And we are also very proud of our sort of social purpose as we see it. Contributing to the life of the community around us, both nationally and internationally, but also working with students from all sorts of backgrounds to get really good qualifications and to go on to transform their own lives and their lives of their families. That is very close to our hearts. But on that note, I'm going to pass across to Alan Evans, the chair of the Attlee Foundation, to introduce the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Philippa. Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you on behalf of the Attlee Foundation, which I have the privilege of chairing, and the Strand group who are putting on this event tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. The Attlee Foundation has existed since 1967 and was set up on the death of Clement Attlee, and since then we've tried to run an annual lecture. We didn't do that in COVID, but we're very pleased to be doing a lecture again in collaboration with the Strand group. This is the Strand group number 64, and before that the predecessor, the Mile End group, ran 109 lectures, so there have been 171 Mile End group and Strand group lectures. Only one person has been at all of those, who is our speaker tonight. 20 years ago, at the end of this year, the first one was held, so I suspect there will be a celebration at the appropriate time to mark 20 years of the Mile End group and the Strand group. It's particularly a privilege to be back in Queen Mary University of London, where John taught for many years, and when I was a minor seminar teacher working with John on the Cabinet Premiership course. The Attlee Foundation is something we're very proud of, and we're trying to do something to raise the profile still further of Attlee, both in terms of his contribution to history during the war and in the period immediately after the war, but also to celebrate the ideas that he stood for, particularly in terms of giving support and helping those most disadvantaged in East London, and we want to do something working with our partners in East London to take that forward. If I can just make one final plug for the Attlee Foundation, if you could take away one of these leaflets, it tells you all you need to know about it, and if you feel inspired either to think of how we could raise money or you want to suggest someone who might be able to help us raise money, we don't have any other forms of income apart from donations. I or any of the other trustees who are here tonight would be very keen to hear from you. But with all that, I will say no more, apart from to welcome John Davis. John is Professor of Government Education at King's College. Dr. John Davis, PhD, OBE, is going to speak on Clement Attlee in East End, then and now. John's going to speak for about 35 minutes. Afterwards, I will then introduce our discussant, who tells me he's down from Dagenham, but actually he's Darren Rodwell, who's the leader of Barking and Dagenham Council, and I think we'll have a really interesting perspective on what John says. We'll then have some Q&A, and then please join us all for a drink afterwards. But with that, I'd like you to welcome our lecturer tonight, Professor John Davis.
First one with glasses, so forgive me. I always think that it's unacceptable, an admission of failure for an academic, a writer, to admit that they are lost for words, especially at the start of a lecture. And in thinking about tonight, what it means for me to give the Attlee lecture here at Queen Mary, University of London, where Attlee took the count in 1945 that was to make him the first majority Labour Prime Minister, a university I had the privilege of studying at and working for from undergraduate to lecturer and Associate Director of Corporate Affairs for a total of 18 years. How personal it is to me, I'll forgive myself for being just a little overawed. What a pleasure it is to be giving the Attlee lecture. The first one I went to was Lord Robin Butler's on Cabinet Government back in 1999. And it was my absolute honour to sit on the board of the Attlee Foundation in the 2000s. So imagine my pride when its current chair, Alan Evans, asked me to give this one. I've been looking forward to it since. Alan suggested a wide-ranging remit to get the annual lecture underway after a few years. So tonight I'm going to talk about Clement Attlee, his life and times, where he stands among modern prime ministers, his East End and what it is today, all woven together through a personal eye. Perhaps a more appropriate title would be Attlee, the East End, Peter Hennessy and me. It is now over 30 years since I first walked through the doors of Queen Mary. I loved it from the first moment. I'd been working just up the road in the city after I left education at 18 for 2 years as a financial control clerk at the late but not lamented Hambros Bank. The banks were hoovering up Essex boys and girls to work in their middle and back offices, but rarely front ones. Those highly paid positions were largely reserved for extended networks of the privileged. For that and for wider reasons involving the soul, I soon decided that banking was not for me. I well remember coming to Queen Mary's Open Day in 1993. A confident, floppy-haired individual sidled up to me and chided me for wearing a whistle. A natty brown, drapey, double-breasted number. Compared to his nonchalant, I'm trying so hard to look like I'm not trying attire, to which I looked him in the eye and growled a line of my dad's, if you want to be the part, you've got to look the part. My oh-so-brief interlocutor backed away. Can't imagine why. For I believed in the idea of a university and I did not have time for anyone belittling the experience. I'm still the same today. I'm the first in the family to stay on for A-levels, let alone anything else. I do not remember the idea of going to a university being a part of my upbringing until A-level teachers started to mention it, something I thought might happen one day, but far into the future. It was my dad who started to whisper the idea of it actually being an immediate option to me in my unhappy first stint in banking. And I chose Queen Mary for its reputation, its welcoming nature, its proximity to our home at the end of the district line in Upminster, and for its East End location. My family were intimately connected to the East End Docklands. On my mum's side, dockers and stevedores, got to get that right, as I was once pulled up by Aunt Sheila for an interview I'd given to The Independent. On my dad's side, Grandad was a Port of London Authority tug captain. Harold Macmillan once said there are three bodies no sensible man directly challenges: the Roman Catholic Church, the Brigade of Guards, and the National Union of Mine Workers. The dockers were every bit as rough and tough, if even more militant in their trade unionism and leftist politics. Though I was born in Plaistow, if the traffic stopped and the wind was in the right direction, perhaps, just perhaps, one could hear the Bow Bells. I was bred in Havering, on the one hand delivered into the wider Labour movement, yet brought up in true blue Essex at the height of the Thatcher Revolution. The contrast of strike cupboards, you'll have to speak to my mum about that one, banking, hiding the Guardian inside the Financial Times when commuting from Buckminster, then reversing that when I got off the tube at Mile End, maybe one can see where the kernel for my part in Heroes or Villains came from. My great stroke of professional fortune came in my final undergraduate year when I was accepted on Queen Mary Professor Peter, now the Lord Hennessy's legendary Cabinet Premiership in the Conduct of British Central Government since 1945 class. At one point, a few years back, of the 5 immediate official advisors to the Prime Minister, 2 had completed that module and a 3rd had studied under Peter at doctoral level. I thought Peter's approach and material by far the best I'd ever experienced, and he took me under his wing. Well, he clearly did a good job, as the Princess Royal briskly told me in her inimitable way earlier this year. I revelled in Peter's teaching, his analysis, his anecdotes, his name-dropping, which is even more shameless than my own. But most of all, his passion, and none more so than for Clement Attlee. I had, of course, heard of the Labour leader, mostly in the context of Winston Churchill's stunning and oh so complicated landslide defeat in 1945. What a way for the British people to repay the greatest war leader this country had ever known. Outside of this, Attlee's name was never really spoken about. Not indoors, a very lively political debating forum, I can tell you. Not at school, not even really for the first 2 years of a history and politics degree in the East End. Peter's teaching was therefore a revelation. I'm not saying that I imbued it all immediately. There is to me a highly sceptical and sometimes contrarian side. Not quite as developed as my great friend John Rentoul's. But when I mistakenly briefly returned to banking after my first degree, I was asked at an interview for Goldman Sachs who my favourite PM was. When I answered Attlee, it was clearly not the answer they were looking for. Good job. Peter's advocacy of Attlee, or the Major as he often called him, was awesome. I once somewhat naughtily said to Peter that his monumental history of the British Civil Service, Whitehall, a book I swear by, was more of a romance than a history. I do sometimes wince when I look back over what I put this good man through to change my life. To which he replied, maybe I did stumble across a lost tribe. I think in some senses one might say that he did something similar regarding Attlee. In book after book, he mined the Attlee archive and contrasted his findings with what he saw as the collapse in leadership and standards of the 1980s, 1990s and 2000s. Analysis which seemed quaint in light of the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss premierships. For the first time I learned about this giant Clement Attlee, a man born into the supremely comfortable upper middle class over in West London, a background, according to Professor Sir Vernon Bogdanor, more affluent than Churchill's. All set to follow his father into the higher legal establishment, but who, after visiting his old fee-paying school Haileybury's outreach settlement with its motto Sursum Corda, lift up your hearts, in Ben Jonson Road, a stone's throw from where we are this evening in Stepney, reputed to be at the time the roughest and least law-abiding borough in London, gave up all his comfort to devote years living and working here. He was shocked, deeply impressed and radicalised by the plight but also the pride, energy and friendliness of the East Enders. Perhaps the first time the extreme introvert came into contact with working class affability. He became in effect a social worker, moved into Limehouse and threw off the learning and the lens of his privileged upbringing, felt that it was his duty, noblesse oblige, to sign up for the First World War, though over age, and was badly ill and injured at Gallipoli in Mesopotamia and on the Western Front. That awful yet supremely powerful phrase, had a good war, was to attach an unquestioned patriotism to the future Labour Prime Minister. Attlee loved his East End. He was MP for Limehouse for 28 years and 5 for Walthamstow West. Time and again, his experiences provided a rooted focus to policy debates on the 1920s and 1930s blight of working class mass unemployment, as he joined Labour, became a councillor, Mayor of Limehouse, MP for the area, Cabinet Minister, Leader, wartime Deputy Prime Minister, and eventually Prime Minister from 1945 to 51. And the East End loved him. Rereading Kenneth Harris's 1980s authorised biography of Attlee, one marvels at not only Attlee's courage overcoming immense shyness and fundamental humility, but how his determination to help his area and his people crops up. I love the story of him overcoming his fear of public speaking, which would lead him to proselytise outside dock gates to exhausted and impoverished workers, sometimes collecting but striking workers elsewhere, from those who barely had more. And also the story that Harris and Professor John Pugh tell of when, in 1920, he was part of a deputation to Downing Street to discuss mass unemployment, accompanied on the walk along the embankment by well-drilled columns of unemployed men, mostly former soldiers from each borough. The mayors left number 10 just in time to see what appeared to be the early stages of a riot. Attlee jogged round to George Street and found his men had moved from their resting place and were marching in perfect order towards the fight. As he recalled the story, he stepped in front and raised his hand. "Stepney, halt!" and ordered an about turn. They listened. And from there he led them back to Stepney, and I quote, "thus saving some broken heads." Just think of the authority of the man among those who respected him. He never evolved into a gifted orator, something that Peter Hennessy joyously contrasted against what he often felt were modern identikit politicians mindlessly parroting whatever the line was. Peter loved this particular exchange between Attlee and a journalist in 1951. "Tell us something on how you view the election prospects." "We shall go in with a good fight, very good chance of winning. We go in competently, we always do." "On what will Labour take its stand?" "Well, that's what we'll be announcing shortly." "What are your immediate plans, Mr. Attlee?" "My immediate plans are to go down to a committee to decide on just that thing as soon as I can get away from here." "Is there anything else you'd like to say about the coming election?" "No." The key to understanding Attlee, the man, was his unblinking determination to right the wrongs of historic extreme inequality and to deliver a level of social justice never seen before. This was his unrelenting drive, beginning before the Great War, then redoubled after his own sacrifice and that of all classes in the First and Second World Wars. And boy, did he deliver. He was a first-rate chair of meetings, especially cabinet. He once took Churchill to task with the cutting line, "A monologue is not a decision." His quiet yet iron-fisted chairmanship of his cabinets of often near irreconcilable giants, Ernest Bevin, Hugh Dalton, Herbert Morrison, Sir Stafford Cripps, Hugh Gaitskell, Harold Wilson, and many others, was to lead to one of the great historic reshapings of Britain. The long-dreamed-for National Health Service and a comprehensive welfare system, along with the nationalisation of a third of the British economy, the first huge moves to end the empire with Indian independence, were all fulfilled. Indeed, I've heard it said that the 1945 Labour manifesto, "Let Us Face the Future," written by Michael Young, another man of privilege who became besotted by the East End, was in effect a history of the Attlee governments. So much were the promises enacted. Just think about that as another London lawyer come Labour leader contemplates how to turn dreams into reality. Add to this the usual warp and woof of governing, only more so, dealing with the new atomic bomb world and deciding that Britain would become a nuclear weapons nation. The sadness that there would be no peace dividend with the onset of the Cold War. The near unbearable strain that all of this placed upon a devastated economy, not to mention Korea, Palestine. Counterintuitively, two somewhat unlikely, up to a point supporters of Attlee were Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit. Granted, both hated the 3 decades-long social and economic consensus that they systematically unpicked in the 1980s. But, as Tebbit told Hennessy in the Radio 4 programme Reflections in 2013, I think we both felt the same way about some of the things which that early Labour government did, which were absolutely right, and which it would have been much more difficult for a Conservative government to do at the time, such as membership of NATO. It was not Churchill that created NATO, it was Attlee and Ernie Bevin. Bevin in particular, one of the truly great men of British politics in my judgment. And the British nuclear deterrent, again, how difficult would that have been if it had been a Conservative government trying to take that through against the Labour Party? And the Labour Party would have been against it. When one considers all this in the round, you can easily understand Hennessy's hero worship and why he was so proud when he adopted the title Attlee Professor of Contemporary Government. But, as I mentioned earlier, Hennessy's post-1980s championing was initially swimming against the tide. And here I want to muse upon the idea of memory, historiography and reputation, and offer perhaps some thoughts as to why and where the Attlee legacy waned, but latterly waxed. The ebb and sometimes flow of a Prime Minister's reputation is a complicated, inexact science, and Attlee's stratospheric comeback was not a given. In poll after poll of academics, Attlee is now regularly thought of as often first among the pantheon of premiers since the war. How did this happen? Hennessy's advocacy was very significant. His work came at a time when the old world of governing, with many of its consensual ways reflecting the experience of mass unemployment and wartime sacrifice, had been turned upside down by the Thatcher Revolution. John Bew underpinned and extended the Attlee reputation in 2016 with his award-winning, big-selling and highly readable Citizen Clem, which caught a modern zeitgeist of a country ill at ease with itself and increasingly lacking the community spirit Attlee so personified. But I now tread carefully in such an audience, mindful that not just my own family members are in attendance, but also those of the Attlee family. I went to see Professor Hennessy a few days ago. I wanted to check a memory of an anecdote he had told me. I'm pretty sure it was the last time I saw Roy Jenkins, Peter told me, around the time of the Iraq invasion. Roy died in January 2003. He was crossing Russell Square and I came out of Senate House. "What's your next book, Roy?" I asked him. "I may return to Attlee," said Roy. "You may recall that I wrote a small biography of him. You and I are responsible for raising him just a little too high on the plinth." I've always thought that was a fascinating exchange. First, because Jenkins's 1948 biography of Attlee was based upon him having known Attlee since a child, because his dad, the Miners MP, Arthur Jenkins, had been parliamentary private secretary to the Labour leader. Second, because I'm an admirer of Roy, thinking his biography of Churchill one of my favourite history books ever, and having had the fortune of interviewing him late in life for my master's dissertation on his time as Chancellor. And third, because I think he's probably right. One can overdo, and hero worship does not help us get to the truth. For those of you still on Twitter X who follow John Rentoul, and really, who doesn't, we all look forward to his forthcoming lecture, The Myth of the Sainted Attlee. It's been promised for about a decade now, and I, for one, can't wait. Another of those rare voices who never went along with the Attlee worship was the late Professor George Jones of the LSE, who, along with Peter, was one of the giants I've had the honour of learning from. Jones had stood for Labour in 1964 and written a biography of Herbert Morrison, whom he thought should have been Prime Minister in the 40s instead. He once went, not exactly head-to-head with Hennessy, but as a competitive advisor to an undergraduate debate here at Queen Mary, jousting over the relative values of the post-war Prime Ministers. Before I repeat his advice to his team, remember this was a debating contest, trying to paint the worst possible picture in order to score points. Attlee is overrated. He had no vision and did not inspire a mouse, an empty taxi drop at 10 Downing Street when Mr. Attlee got out. A modest man with much to be modest about. He had no strong views on politics except perhaps about India. He was a disaster in foreign affairs. His giving up and withdrawing from Palestine and India bequeathed to the world the terrible problems of Israel and the Palestinians, and of Kashmir bedeviling relations between India and Pakistan and leaving us a benighted Bangladesh. Domestically, he left the UK burdened with a legacy that took a generation to be repaired by Thatcher. An economy that hated enterprise and innovation, dominated by protectionist employers, farmers and trade unions who suck the energy out of workers and consumers, a welfare state that encouraged dependency of its citizens on handouts, and a health service based on Stalinist principles. He operated and perpetuated a system of cabinet government that meant policies were produced only after complex, time-wasting processes that squeezed all involved into the lowest common denominator. He wasted his majority and kept the British people in poverty and failed to release their dynamism. A petty-minded PM, concerned to win honours for himself and incapable of leadership. Wow. In 2011, after the statue of Attlee was relocated from outside Limehouse Library to his magnificent setting here before the University Library, I was asked by the then Deputy Principal, Professor Philip Ogden, to put on a bit of a show for its unveiling. I thought Lord Mandelson would be perfect. Great speaker, always box office, no longer in power, so easier to get, and pertinently, grandson of Herbert Morrison. Peter lived up to my hopes. You can see the video on our website. He began by saying what a delicious irony it was for him being asked to unveil the statue. After the lecture, Professor Jones quite pointedly asked me, whose idea was this? I said I'd asked Professor Hennessy to write to Mandelson, suggesting he might like to bury the hatchet after all these years. George smiled. He absolutely should have buried the hatchet in the statue of Clement Attlee. True story. Big waters. I share this because if you knew George, you'd likely be chuckling at these lines, often delivered in a bluff, pseudo-aggressive manner which hid a heart of gold. But also because a bit of balance will help us get closer to the reality, which is that Clement Attlee was undoubtedly one of the greatest prime ministers of our country. The case for the prosecution I've just read is simply the flip side of a long life well lived. His record in achieving so much that those with little had, his record in achieving so much that those with little had needed for so long, finally, is quite enough to cement his place at the very top of the pantheon. He was decisiveness personified in pursuit of results. But to decide is to choose, and to choose is to disappoint, and he did that for many in the decades after his fall. All Prime Ministers since the Second World War have left office suffering unpopularity of one sort or another. Attlee was no exception, being booted out of number 10 after losing narrowly to Churchill in the 1951 general election, then beaten more comprehensively by Sir Anthony Eden in 1955. Attlee's reputation fell, there being little immediate thanks in politics for a very hard job well done. But what I would like to chew on for a moment is why some reputations resurge, but others stay in the doldrums. Who here thinks that Liz Truss will be remembered even a little more fondly than she is right now? Eden certainly is not after his shameful activities over the Suez crisis. On the other hand, post-war premiers such as James Callaghan and John Major have seen a resurgence, as have, certainly in my opinion, those of the two giants of the past 40 years, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. Following her death, I think Thatcher's performance is only going to rise in stature, especially after Charles Moore's masterly authorised biographies, and even in spite of Truss's bizarre cosplay. Moreover, for those of us in Liverpool last week, though Blair was not to be seen, his influence was everywhere. The years since the Brexit referendum have powerfully underlined that there was more to New Labour than Iraq. More problematically, I do wonder how Boris Johnson's legacy will fare over the coming years and decades. While his ignominious time in Downing Street is rightly regarded by most as one of our nation's great humiliations, there are those that still revere him. And though largely based upon promises that simply could not be kept and proven lies, his building an electoral coalition that few could comprehend and subsequently winning a sizable majority of 80 in 2019 will be studied for a long time. By the by, I do not judge 80 seats a landslide. I reserve that term for a three-figures shift. The last PM I will discuss here is Sir Winston Churchill, voted the greatest Briton of all time in a BBC poll in 2002. I wonder if he would be so if run again. For the modern world's move towards the removal of context and the simplistic and sometimes moronic judging of yesterday's figures by today's values does mean that I do not think me Nostradamus to predict a rough ride for Churchill's reputation in the coming years. Don't get me wrong, we all know that Churchill's legacy is as complex as can be, from the Dardanelles to D-Day, from the Boer War to Indian independence. His long life and vehement opinions require close attention, sensitivity and tolerance to context. As the thoughtful Tory peer and Times columnist Danny Finkelstein wrote in 2019, Churchill was a racist but still a great man. Even though the wartime Prime Minister was a lifelong white supremacist, his strengths far outweigh his weaknesses. This is not easy to comprehend for the two-dimensional world of social media. Attlee's return to grace proves, I think, that in an age where we question whether decency and indeed actual delivery matters, Attlee's ascendancy is all the more important. He, I hope, sets our sights higher just as we emerge from what has been several years of plumbing the depths. And what of Attlee's beloved East End now? It's obviously changed hugely from his time. When he first encountered it pre-Great War, it would have been an area dominated by the London docks, with the engine of the City of London financing and ensuring just beyond its confines the very centre of the biggest empire the world had ever seen. Little villages of interconnected slums housing some of the poorest people in the country, who were the precarious human labour backbone of the biggest port in the world, employing some 100,000 people and countless more in ancillary activity, including criminal. It has been estimated that up to a third of some ships' holds went missing. All downwind from the pollution of London's manufacturing industries. The sociology of how people helped each other survive, the folklore of not locking your front door and the power of the matriarchy are all contained in another huge selling book of its day, 1957's Family and Kinship in East London by the aforementioned Michael Young. Then came the devastation of the Blitz, focused upon the Docklands. My own grandmother was bombed out, as she would say, not once, not twice, but 3 times. How Attlee must have been pained by his people's suffering and determined to beat fascism come what may. He was convinced that we had to bomb Germany more than they were doing to us, and unflinching in his support for the atomic destruction of Japan. The post-World War changed so much, in my opinion, lots for the better. Consensus politics saw successive governments responsible for total employment, at least until Thatcher's time. Slum clearance in the new towns gave people decent housing, but often at the cost of the community spirit. The closure of the docks from the late 1960s to the early 1980s meant unskilled and semi-skilled labour was no longer soaked up. As Lord Heseltine, one of the visionaries of the post-docks East End, said in a Mile End Group lecture in 2008, in a word, the area had become uncompetitive. Those who could get up and go, got up and went. My own family included. Coming to Queen Mary in 1993, one lunchtime I took some sandwiches and got the 277 bus out to the then bankrupt Canary Wharf on the site of the closed West India docks. There was only the first tower, 1 Canada Square. The place was deserted and a security guard walked across mud to ask me why I was there. The received wisdom was that this was a white elephant which would stand as lonely testimony to a grandiose and doomed attempt to transform the East End. Just a decade later, Canary Wharf had become the second largest financial centre in Europe, second only to the City of London, bigger than Frankfurt or Paris. Granted, the vast majority of unemployed dockers were not to become the financial services workers. Some worked as builders, cleaners and security guards, but their kids did. Globalisation created the Docklands. In some ways it killed them, and then it recreated the area. The awesome sweep of big history. Will Canary Wharf continue to thrive? What with HSBC, the first bank to announce its move back to the city? The next wave of change may well be underway. During the 90s and noughties, change accelerated. Most of the many pubs around Queen Mary closed, historic centres of community lost. Harris's authorised biography lists the ones that Attlee had to frequent, then being headquarters of particular trade unions. The last of these to go was the Hayfield at Stepney, once a favourite of mine. To note, I'm reliably informed by Dr. Brown that while pubs continue to close up and down the country since 2000, the number of pubs in Hackney actually increased by more than a third. I wonder why he knows that. I also well remember the police signs outside Mile End Station warning of the dangers of mugging. Alerts that were subtly moved by one senior Queen Mary professor during college open days lest they put off parents of prospective students. I always thought that the frisson of fear getting out of the tube for some Westminster and Whitehall types unused to the area gave an added edge to early Mile End group seminars. It certainly does seem very different coming back here this evening, so much more civilised. Another dramatic change from Attlee's time is in the ethnic makeup of the East End. It was interesting to read in John Pugh's book just how contested the area was in Attlee's time by the indigenous population and the relative newcomers, the Irish and Eastern European Jews. I found it fascinating how political rallies could literally be bruising encounters with Yiddish often spoken. The East End has, of course, been a landing ground for wave after wave of immigration. Before the Irish and Jewish Eastern Europeans had been the Huguenots, evidence of whom is to be found hundreds of years later across Spitalfields. And after them, the post-war income saw West Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, African and Eastern European again. Whilst every one of these led to tensions of one kind or another, I would say the East End of today is not only more mixed than ever, it's calmer too. Linked here is the dramatic upturn in the quality of the area's state schools, sending ever higher numbers to excellent universities such as this. Something that has always intrigued me is just where is the East End? The Thames is obviously its southern border, though the areas immediately across the river in Bermondsey and Rotherhithe are brethren. And I think most would say that where Aldgate meets the square mile is its most western point, though this itself is not hard and fast as the city begins to encroach. To the north, I very much enjoyed the late philosopher Professor Brian McGee's memoir Clouds of Glory, published in 2004, which documented his oh so colourful growing up among the costermongers of Hoxton Market in N1, but he thought it was the East End. Nowadays, not least among militant members of my own team, there seems to be a specific North East London identity, even though they live in Walthamstow, East 17. Attlee's latest stomping ground. It's a complicated world. But perhaps the most important aspect here is the East End's gradual move eastwards. I've had extremists tell me that Plaistow is not the East End. I should have directed them to the East Enders' end credits. I myself was corrected when Dame Vera Lynn passed away in 2020 and obituaries said she had been born in East Ham, Essex, which I railed against, but was corrected by Dr. Jack Brown, among others, who pointed out that this only changed in 1965 with the Greater London system we know today. The East End postcode finishes at East Ham before Barking. Nowadays, for many in the media, and I think for me personally, I think that the East End probably finishes at the M25. But this is very definitely not the view of many, and I look forward to the views of my good friend Darren Rodwell, leader of Barking and Dagenham, as respondent. This is a massive evolution encompassing hundreds of thousands of people with real challenges for future governance. And perhaps the biggest difference from Attlee's years is the perception of what the East End is. The generation before mine knew what the East End was. It was poverty, slums, crime, chirpy Cockney characters, wide boys, women wearing a lot of gold, rhyming slang, sharp practices down street markets, intense community spirit, supreme stoicism through the Second World War, working class underdogs who stood up to Hitler and who could never be beaten. Though not to the same extent as Attlee's time, there are still parts of today's East End, in such places as Stratford, East Ham, Dagenham and Harold Hill, that need a lot of love, attention and funding. But the transformation of the West of the East has been nothing short of revolutionary. The concept of East London is now, for the first time ever, seen as edgy, cool, desirable. I remember Lord Macpherson, then head of the Treasury, coming out to the East and remarking, "So this is where all the young people are." The Olympics was clearly a game changer. Not only was it a flawless spectacle, the truly massive regeneration of the area, still ongoing, has created a new East London focal point, not to mention my beloved West Ham getting what has been called the deal of the century when moving into the Olympic Stadium. The transformation of Spitalfields and Shoreditch is simply breathtaking. For me, this was encapsulated when in 2014, the legendary East Ender David Bailey shared a photograph of Christchurch Spitalfields towering above derelict streets in the 1960s. He said, "This is the most dramatic change. Any moment Chanel's going to open a shop here. I don't mind change, it's what life is." In 2018, Chanel opened a shop. Talking with Peter Hennessy the other day, he took great fun in telling me that I was in some ways the complete opposite of Attlee. Twice the size, loud and like being around people. Perhaps Peter's always given as good as he got from me. The more I've learnt about Clement Attlee, the more I've come to respect his record and cherish his character. His care and attention to the people of the East End in particular needs to be remembered and celebrated, as does the mission of the foundation named after him. As ever, the last word goes to Peter. Given the quality of Prime Ministers in recent memory, perhaps we need to raise Attlee's reputation even higher. Thank you.
That was magnificent, and I think if the Prof were here, he would be proud of you, he really would. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask Darren Rothwell, who John referred to, leader of Barking and Dagenham Council, and also prospective parliamentary candidate for Barking, to say a few words on what John has said, but also his perspective as someone who really is now rebuilding part of East London in Barking. Darren.
Thank you very much. Wow, how do I match that? An educated lad. My God, that was good. But it was so true. Attlee, for me, was the best Labour government we've ever had. The most working class. And that would surprise people, because he wasn't working class. But he knew what we were thinking. He knew how we felt. He got our pride. He knew how tough we were. And we've seen that, generation after generation. We are a place like no other. And it goes back further. Actually, you're all part of Barking. You laugh. But the Tower of London is built on Barking's lands by William the Conqueror. It went all the way to Southend. It was our women that got equal pay and made sure you got the vote. It was Lord Denman that actually got the anti-slavery bill through Parliament, not William Wilberforce, some northerner. It was a lad from Dagenham. We won the World Cup for this country. There'll be more. Barking lad. Sir Alf Ramsey, a Dagenham lad. The golden age of football was Barking and Dagenham. But we let you have your little villages. We got Tower Hamlets and Newham, West Ham, East Ham. But they all started in Barking. Barking is actually older than London. We gave you the square mile. We made commerce happen. In fact, Henry Bird funded the War of Independence. Sorry about Trump. We couldn't do much about that. So am I proud to come from a place that built a legacy seen by a man that understood the people? Of course I am. And that's why I've got the Labour Party Volume 1, 2 and 3 in my shelf, on my shelf, in my home. When I do a Zoom call, I have to say never with Ed, but when I've done a Zoom call with other politicians who I greatly admire, they're on the back, because it was the Attlee government. The government that I always believe built the best foundations this country's ever had. After a broken Britain, we said that everyone needed a home, a good Labour policy. Everyone got a home. My grandparents, who lived in a shack, got a home with 10 children, may I say. Very proud. We then said that no one should starve in a civilised society. And yes, we still had the situation of rationing, but no one starved as a nation. We looked out for one another. We then said clever people from disadvantaged backgrounds could go to university for free because they would pay back over generations with their intelligence, with their nous, with their ability to change the world. And lastly, we have the NHS. My wife will tell you it's wonderful. She was born in Mile End. She will tell you that I'm an Essex boy because I am Barking and Dagenham born and bred. We had this ongoing argument. That's when I wrote a paper, said it was New East, New Thinking, because she wouldn't allow me to use New East End, because I'm Essex. But that's because people have forgotten what we stand for, what we mean. In 1936, when the middle class and the upper class said, oh, fascism's a good thing, the working class said, no, it's not. And we fought in many wars since. When we saw it again in Barking and Dagenham in 210, we stood together again, now of many different cultures. In fact, if you know the East End, you know we are the most diverse area in the country. Still the most impoverished. Because we haven't had the investment that you've seen in other parts. That's why levelling up is a farce. Because poverty is still hard and fast in the East End. From Tower Hamlets through to Barking and Dagenham, we have that fight every day. But it's what makes us. It's what gives us our strength. It's what made us change the world for the better. So I'm really proud that Attlee, along with so many other incredible leaders from the East End, came together and represented us in that place that no one knows. That place that isn't for people like me. I'm proud that they gave us the book on how to manage what we needed to manage. The problem today is there isn't enough of us in those places. We need to change that. For the first time I came to this university was last week. I've never been here before. But what I saw here was an incredible ecosystem of activity of young people from different backgrounds enjoying each other's company and coming up with the new tomorrow. Attlee inspired that. He inspired it in people like me, those long-term, aspirational poor, and in incredible moments, you will see that again in the East End. We may not be the richest, we may not be the most powerful, but we're the most hardened, and we will always be the disruptors of those in power who think they know better. Because if we hadn't have been, the union movement wouldn't have happened like it did under Keir Hardie and the whole movement in the East End. You wouldn't have had the rights you have today. Women wouldn't have got the vote. We wouldn't have stopped slavery. In that way, we wouldn't have changed the world. The mass would have had nothing, and others would have had too much. So I'm proud to come from the East End, whether it's the East End my wife knows or whether it's the East End that I believe I'm part of. That debate will never be resolved, and I'm sure she'll always win. But what I'm really proud of are the people that came before us, the people that are able to articulate what makes us the East End. What I'm really proud of is the people that are going to come next. Those mixtures of people from different diverse backgrounds making a new culture that is East End. Whilst they may not have the estuary voice I have, they will have the passion that will carry on taking this country forward. And I'm proud to say I come from the East End and I'm part of a movement that was pioneered by Attlee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren, for that perspective. And now it's going to be opened up for questions for 20 minutes or so. You can ask them to John or to Darren or to me if you want. But please, when asking a question, people are not very good at this, but say who you are and what your organisation is, if you have one. And that's very helpful for anyone listening. I want to start with one question to you, John, which I was thinking while you were talking. You mentioned Thatcher and you mentioned Blair. You also touched briefly on John Major. Thatcher was in power for 11 years, Blair for 10, Major for 7. The bulk of the achievements of the Attlee government were done in 4 years. It was a massive pace of change, and we don't list them all again. You can read them in our brochure. But how come the pace of change was so quick compared with the way in which change nowadays seems to take longer?
I think it's, in some respects, even faster than what you're saying. I mean, Dalton, in our Treasury class, we look at this. Dalton delivered. I mean, he was out of power by 1947, and he delivered the money for the National Health Service in like 2 years or 18 months. It's incredible pace. And as I was saying about the manifesto, they just did the lot. Now, how was that possible? Well, obviously, so much of it was just wartime controls. If you've got what a lot of people have described in Britain as being the most mobilised economy, society of any of the combatants in the Second World War, you could actually just go, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. There's no real debate here, and especially if you had one of the great historic majorities as well behind you. And so I think that is the key part of the logistics. In terms of the spirit of it, I've heard it said by many people, for me most memorably by Tony Benn, if we proved how good we were at warfare, let's prove how good we are at welfare. If you can do these things, if you can build nuclear bombs, if you can do all these incredibly complex, costly things, then surely you can put your mind to a National Health Service and a comprehensive welfare system.
Very good. Right, questions from the floor. I'm going to take them in groups of 3. I've got one there, the lady in red there, and Bob Saunders at the back there. Speak up loud. Is there a mic anywhere or not?
Well, I'll just get up
shout.
here.
Okay.
People might be able to hear me well. Thank you very much, John, Professor John Davis. My name is Subhas Thakra. I'm the current chairman of the Attlee Centre, which is a spin-off from Attlee Foundation, which wasn't mentioned earlier, so I thought I'll plug that. We run a beautiful youth centre in Tower Hamlets, and I've previously been a trustee of the foundation before the spin-off happened. And very interesting. I learned a lot, which is fantastic because I hope to hopefully be able to pass that on. I'm an immigrant in the UK. I was thrown out from Uganda in 1972 and came here penniless. And what such wonderful environment that we encountered that enabled me to achieve the success that I did. And that's something to share with everyone. Question to you is, do you think in the changing world that we've got that we could get Clement Attlee kind of characters again?
Lady there.
Hi, I'm Susie Stride. I'm an East Ender, and Ed Ball's really well. And I'm up for Parliament in Harlow and hoping to run the East End. But my question is, 2 things. It's a simple question in some ways. How do we ensure we have people from working class backgrounds getting into Parliament? But in some ways we know those answers. Trade union movement, but still our political parties still struggle with it. So you get people in, but they play their little role, but it's just a little role that they play. So that, but also, how do we get leaders like Clement, who came from a very wealthy background, came to Ben Jonson Road, got on his hands and knees, served poor people, radicalised him, transformed him, made him one of the greatest leaders the country's ever had. Why are we not seeing that now? Why are the routes so different into politics that people... And I don't have a problem with those routes, except maybe we would have greater, more radical, more passionate leaders if they took the same route as Clement Attlee.
Thank you for that. We'll take one at the back there and then we'll get some on.
Thanks. So my name's Robert Saunders. I'm here at Queen Mary. Thank you, John. I really agreed with what you said about the importance of complex and nuanced judgments. When you were talking about Churchill, you talked about how we have to hold together their strengths and weaknesses. So with that in mind, I wondered what you thought Attlee's weaknesses were and what you think he got wrong as a Prime Minister.
Very good. Well, do you want to answer those two? And Darren might want to say something on the first two.
Okay, Subash, lovely to be reconnected again. Could we see an Attlee again? Well, I mean, one of the really goes back to the first question of Alan's. Really, I mean, what they were trying to do was so fundamental. I mean, you don't. You save an NHS, but you don't build another one, do you? Right? And so, the skills of Attlee, chairing such disparate characters. I mean, there's that wonderful book around Lincoln, isn't it? About the team of rivals. I've often thought that Attlee cabinet, and actually maybe Wilson and Callahan's in the 70s, big figures. And it takes strange, complex characters to actually chair those figures, right? To actually deliver the huge performance that Attlee cabinet did. I mean, when you actually really read about Attlee, how he got to where he got to, there's a lot of luck there as well. Huge amounts of luck. It's the destruction of Labour in the 1930s. It's the incredible betrayal of MacDonald and Snowden. I mean, it's barely believable. I mean, Attlee never looked, like this very pleasant, nice man, used to cut, I think it was MacDonald short. He would never look at him. He wouldn't speak to him because he believed he'd betrayed him. But then, because of all of that, and everyone lost him, all the big Labour figures lost in 1935, wasn't it? 31, and then in 35 again, wasn't it? So Attlee was kind of like last man standing. Big question, that one, Susie. Working class people in Parliament. Interesting one, interesting. Plenty of Tory working class. One from my own school, Sir Bob Neal. Wouldn't know it though. Wouldn't know it. There you go. And so, and they've got every right to be who they want to be. So there are working class people coming through, and they're always worth. The union movement obviously provided so many. And I guess that the decline of the union movement from the 80s onwards meant a decline of opportunities in that sense, I guess. I mean, I certainly hope that this man will we'll bolster it, in like a year's time. Rob, lovely question. What did Attlee get wrong? Look, as I think I was sort of like hinting at, I wasn't a big Attlee fan. I'm gradually becoming one, and I think that over economics, really just didn't understand it. This is a man who should have understood it, who understood it more than I thought he did. When you reread some of the big biographies, he really tried to understand economics. But by 1945, 46, 47, Britain is facing starvation. We were 6 weeks away. We had 6 weeks of supplies in 1947. We were feeding Germany, a quarter of Germany that was starving. We were bankrupt from 1942 onwards. We were looking for American loans that we desperately hoped that they would just give us, and they didn't. And so I think that if there's one glaring error, and Attlee, when asked, do you understand economics, when he was in the cabinet, said something along the lines of, Why should I? I've got Gateschall, Jay and Wilson. So I don't need to understand that. I think he probably did. And there was a lot of economic crises throughout those years. Initially, Lend-Lease in 45, the convertibility crisis in 47, the devaluation, the botched devaluation of 1949, which took weeks, partly because Cripps was dying in Switzerland, and so they didn't want to act without him because they respected him too much. But all the while, the pound was falling, and so I think that would be my go-to.
Darren, do you want to say anything about the first two questions about getting more range of people in Parliament now?
So I think the problem we've had with governance in this country probably for the last 20 years is you have to be seen in the right places by the right people with the right mates. And it's brought us into what I would say is playground politics. And it's allowed people like Boris Johnson to become big figures. But if you look at someone like Boris Johnson, in truth, he was never a big figure. He's a big personality. But when real decisions had to be made, there was no leadership there. And I've met the man many times when he was Mayor of London. In fact, the first time I met him, he was eating porridge. And he was like, as he does. And I just went over and said, hi, I've been leader for 2 days. But he was just another person. And what we've got to understand is these are just people. And if you want to get things done, you need to find the right-minded people from many different backgrounds. And what we actually had was a lot of people from the same background. And I've got no problem, universities are wonderful, but they don't build cathedrals. You know, working people build the cathedral. They might design them, they don't build them. And what we need to do is make sure our politics reflect that. And one of the things I'm really pleased about in the Labour movement at the moment is they went out and they got people from their respective communities, understanding the respective problems. And it's really interesting, you say, you know, Attlee and what he did. He didn't have all the answers, he got people around him, and that's why I believe it was probably the most working class government that brought the working class reasoning to the place. And when you look at what Sir Robin Wales did in Newham back in the day, he knew the place, he knew his people, he knew what he could do, and Newham absolutely flourished, and the Olympics happened. When you look at what I've done in 10 years in Barking and Dagenham, I've brought £5 billion worth of international investment in. I've done the biggest house building programme since the Second World War. Our aspiration, university, you know, our schools, we knew what we needed to do after beating the BNP. So it's really important that we have people that know that they've got to be there to serve their place. And I think that's been missing in politics in the last 20 or so years. Whilst I didn't like Mrs Thatcher, I've got to be honest, I did too many marches against her to like her. I knew why I didn't like her, and I think the problem with the politics we've had in recent decades is there's never been real personality there of leadership.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions. Ed, and then two up there as well.
Ed Balls, I've had the pleasure to teach with John on the Treasury class for 8 years, and it's a skill to hold a whole room spellbound for 40 minutes while you speak, and you did that today with brilliance, so congratulations, that was a great lecture. I've got a serious question. I was tempted to say, by the way, to Darren, that certain things you can eat for breakfast in public. Porridge is good. Spaghetti's bad. Pizza's bad. Bacon sandwiches. I was going to pick up, John, you talked about how we revise our view of senior politicians. And there were some that you didn't mention. And I want to ask about one you didn't mention in your speech, but you've just done so in your questions. Because of course, as you said, Attlee was a great champion of young talent, and he was very proud to have Wilson and Gateschall and Jay in his his government, and he sort of nurtured them. But then Wilson walked out of his cabinet in 1950 over prescription charges and funding for defence. And I just wondered, I mean, Wilson is a figure who probably within the Labour movement there's been more revisionism about than any figure. Ben Pimlott did a brilliant job of changing people's perceptions of Wilson, but I wanted to ask you, what is your view as a historian in retrospect of Wilson as a Prime Minister and a leader? And more importantly, what do you think that Attlee would have thought of Wilson at the time he walked out? And as Wilson's career then unfolded, if Attlee could have seen Wilson's leadership, was in the end Wilson the Attlee of his generation?
Gentleman in the middle and then Tony Travers.
Mark Fenton, former student of John's MA course, former head teacher and former Essex boy, actually, as well. It's always struck me that one of the more remarkable things about Attlee was the fact that he was able to remain party leader of Labour for 20 years. Do you think that was just down to luck? And also, do you think, why do you think it is that sort of span of time seems inconceivable for any party leader now?
Okay. Tony Travers and then James Ellis, and then I'll get some more from...
I'm Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. Attlee is absolutely synonymous with the creation of the welfare state. But actually, in terms of the pantheon of great centre-left or Labour figures in the East End, competes with George Lansbury in popularism. In many ways, Lansbury and popularism is better remembered, I should say this at this event, but better remembered, radical in the Labour Party.
You know that there is a rival Lansbury lecture. Okay. We don't like him.
We're all pluralists here. But seriously, why do you think Lansbury, John, and Darren, is sort of remembered in the way he is, rather more as a leading East End figure than Attlee, who is overwhelmingly associated with the welfare state?
Final one in this round, at the back there.
I'm James Ellis, and I'm also at Queen Mary and a former colleague of John's when he was here. John, some of the big prime ministers that you mentioned who've often topped the charts either because of their greatness, such as Churchill, or controversial nature, such as Blair and Thatcher, have had an idea of Britain in the world. And they promoted this country as an international player. Attlee is distinct in that because he thought of Britain as the half and the 2.5 after the end of the... Would you put his foreign policy along the lines of his economic policy, or do you see it as part of his success?
Right. Oh, these are meaty questions, aren't they? Huh? Okay, Ed. Wilson. Right, yes. One of the things I was just mentioning about Attlee and MacDonald. Attlee prized loyalty. So for Bevan to walk out, and let's be frank, Wilson was the junior partner. There was another one, Freeman. So Wilson. I mean, I think most people would look at Wilson's resignation as a very pragmatic one. An eye on the leadership going forwards, and let's face it took him 13 years, but he got it right, didn't he, right? Or 12 years. So it is very interesting that, I mean, the cabinet that by 1950-51, they were very tired, ill, well, they were dying or dead. When you think of Cripps or you think of Bevan or Attlee himself. And so it wouldn't have been the same, I think, impact than if he'd have resigned in 1946 or 1947. But then, I think it's really interesting, which comes on to the second point about the 20 years. That period after Attlee loses in 1951, he's been at the top a long time. He'd been ill in 50-51. You would have thought he'd retire then, but he didn't. And that's partly because Labour divided so heavily then between the Bevanites and the Gateschalites. One of the reasons it lost several elections in a row. And so Attlee himself, I think, confided very privately saying that Anaran Bevan was the natural leader after him, but he just couldn't trust him. He couldn't trust him to blow the whole thing up. Wilson wasn't really mentioned at that time. He wasn't the figure. And so I don't think he would have been that concerned. So that 20-year business, I mean, yeah, to be leader, you know, from before the Second World War, all the way through the Second World War, and then through to 1955. Why don't we see that now? Well, it's become fast, hasn't it? You know, you lose an election, you move on quite quickly, often. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn gloriously lost in 2017 and stayed on to lose even more gloriously in 2019. You know, I think it's also, I think for this particular story, I think it's luck again, what we're talking about, with people dropping out. So in 1935, when the big figures lost, and it was just Attlee there, really. Lansbury was there as well, wasn't he? And so I think that there's that to be added in. So you've got the division, you've got the big figures not being there, and then, well, not having an election from 1935 to 1945. So I think I think it's a bit of an anomaly, if I'm being honest. Okay, Tony, Lansbury. Ooh. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Why? And I think I was touching on that, I mean, in the first half of my lecture, which I'll give you to read. Which was about how Attlee's not really remembered in the East End in all kinds of ways, whereas a Lansbury kind of is, a Keir Hardie kind of is, but an Attlee's not. I think there's two things there. I think that the fame of Attlee as Prime Minister overshadows the earlier era, and the earlier era, he wasn't a superstar. He was somebody who was so competent, he was so trustworthy, just calm. When I was talking about the horse, Stepney, I respected him. But this is not a charismatic figure in any way. And so I think that for all those reasons, you're entirely correct. Lansbury is remembered as an East End figure in a way that Attlee is not. My own learning has come to that understanding. I didn't really know much about Attlee. I do now. And then we've got James, idea of Britain in the world. Yeah, really good question. I like that a lot. That George Jones tirade about he didn't understand foreign affairs. He did understand foreign affairs. He understood India very well. He'd been on the India Commission in the late 20s and in the 30s. He understood, and India, you know, I would say, is probably the biggest question, certainly of the British Empire, the British state and their empire at this particular time. I'm fascinated by reading about this and some other work I'm doing, just going through, and I know that you know this stuff well too, about when Attlee, you know, so the 1945 election is called. After it's called, Churchill gives the green light for the Americans to drop the atomic bomb. He doesn't talk to Attlee about it. He gives the green light privately after the election's called. Bit tricky that. The election, and then the election happens, and we don't get the result the next day because of the forces, and so it took 3 weeks to count the vote. In this time, the Americans are getting ready to drop the bomb. Attlee becomes Prime Minister. He immediately goes out to Potsdam, where Truman says, "You know about the bomb business," and just like a very simple letter. And Attlee goes, "Yep. It's a big bomb, isn't it?" He didn't know. He didn't know what it was. When it's, you know, I'm told it's a bloody big bomb. That right? Yeah, it's a bloody big bomb. What's really interesting, and once it happens, as I was saying, what's interesting here is that Attlee was unflinching in that atomic decision. But what's even more interesting is that Attlee might not have known about the atomic bomb, but Stalin did. And more intriguingly, so did de Gaulle. because the Manhattan Project will also contain the Canadians, which contained some Quebecois who gave de Gaulle a briefing, so our own Prime Minister knew less than Stalin and de Gaulle. Now, when it comes to a wider view of foreign affairs, Attlee, at the very centre of some of the big moments.